At my granddaughter's wedding, I noticed my name tag said, "The old lady paying for everything." I smiled when I read it. Not because it was funny, not because it didn't hurt. I smiled because at 68 years old, I had finally learned that humiliation delivered with a smile was still humiliation. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and let me know where you're watching from, because what happened that night changed the way I looked at my family forever. The ballroom at the Grand Windsor Hotel glowed with soft golden light as guests drifted across the marble floor, carrying champagne glasses and tiny crystal plates filled with expensive hors d'oeuvres. Everything looked beautiful. The white roses lining the staircase, the string quartet near the fountain, the giant chandeliers sparkling overhead like falling stars. My granddaughter Olivia had always dreamed of a wedding like this, and I had paid for nearly every inch of it. I adjusted the pale blue silk jacket resting on my shoulders and glanced down once more at the laminated card pinned neatly against my chest. The old lady paying for everything. Even now, standing in the middle of that elegant ballroom, I could still feel the sting of those words pressing against my ribs harder than the pin holding the tag in place. "Mrs. Whitmore?" the young woman at the reception table had asked earlier, smiling politely as she handed it to me. At first I thought it was a mistake. A printing error. Something careless and embarrassing that would immediately be corrected. But when I looked up, I saw Vanessa standing near the bar with two bridesmaids, laughing into her champagne flute while glancing directly at me. My daughter-in-law didn't look surprised. She looked entertained. I said nothing. I simply pinned the tag onto my jacket and walked inside. That was the moment something cold settled quietly inside my chest. Not anger, not even heartbreak, just clarity. "Helen," my son Daniel called from across the ballroom. He hurried toward me with the nervous energy of a man trying very hard not to notice something uncomfortable. "Doesn't this place look incredible?" I looked at my son's tuxedo, the polished shoes I'd helped pay for, the silver watch I'd given him after his father passed away. "It's beautiful," I said softly. Daniel's eyes flickered briefly toward my name tag before quickly looking away. That hurt more than the words themselves. Because he saw it. He knew. And he chose silence. Vanessa appeared beside him a moment later in a fitted ivory gown that probably cost more than my first car back in 1978. She kissed the air beside my cheek without touching me. "Helen, thank you again for everything," she said brightly. "None of this could have happened without you." Behind her, one of the bridesmaids snorted into her drink. Vanessa smiled wider. "Seriously," she added, "you're basically our family sponsor tonight." A few people nearby laughed quietly. Not loud enough to make a scene, just enough to make sure I heard it. I folded my hands carefully in front of me. The pianist near the dance floor started playing "Can't Help Falling in Love." Somewhere across the room, Olivia was taking wedding photos beneath a wall of white orchids. She looked radiant, innocent, happy. I told myself to focus on that. But then I heard a man behind me whisper to his wife, "Guess we know who paid for the open bar." More laughter. Soft, polite, sharp as broken glass. I reached up and touched the edge of the name tag again. The plastic felt cold against my fingertips. And for the first time that evening, I realized something far more painful than being mocked by strangers. This hadn't been a joke someone made at the last minute. Someone had planned it. Someone had printed it. Someone had thought about it long enough to type the words, center the letters, laminate the card, and place it carefully at the front desk waiting for me to arrive. The ceremony began 20 minutes later beneath a ceiling draped in white fabric and hanging lights that looked like floating candles. Guests slowly filled the rows of cream-colored chairs while servers moved quietly between them, carrying silver trays of champagne. I sat alone in the second row on the bride's side because Vanessa had explained earlier that the front row needed to be balanced for photographs. I nodded as though I understood. In truth, I had stopped asking questions the moment I realized every answer would only humiliate me further. The musicians began playing a soft piano version of "A Thousand Years" as Olivia appeared at the far end of the aisle holding her father's arm. She looked so much like Daniel had looked at 18 that it nearly stole the breath from my chest. The same gentle eyes, the same nervous smile. For a moment, everything around me disappeared. The ballroom, the whispers, the awful name tag still pinned to my jacket. All I could see was the little girl who used to run barefoot through my backyard chasing fireflies in mason jars during summer evenings. I remembered brushing tangles from her blonde hair before kindergarten. I remembered helping her bake chocolate chip cookies on rainy Saturdays while Daniel worked late shifts after his divorce. I remembered every school recital, every scraped knee, every birthday candle. I had loved that child with every quiet piece of my heart. Olivia reached the altar and turned slightly toward the guests. Her eyes found mine immediately. She smiled softly. Real warmth. Real affection. It was the first genuine thing I had felt all evening. I smiled back and pressed my fingertips together in my lap to stop them from trembling. Then Vanessa leaned toward a wedding coordinator and whispered something while pointing directly at me. Within seconds, a young man in a black suit approached my chair holding a polite but uncomfortable expression. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "would you mind removing your name badge during the ceremony? It is showing in some of the camera shots." I stared at him for a moment. The room suddenly felt very cold despite the hundreds of candles flickering around us. "Of course," I said softly. He thanked me and walked away too quickly, like someone escaping a difficult conversation. I removed the badge carefully and slipped it into my purse beside my reading glasses. The tiny click of the purse closing sounded louder than the music. Daniel never turned around once. Not even when the coordinator spoke to me. Not even when I sat there alone holding a laminated joke that his wife had pinned to my chest like a price tag. The officiant began speaking about love, commitment, and family. Strange words. Heavy words. I listened while watching Vanessa dab imaginary tears from the corners of her eyes. Every few minutes, she glanced around the ballroom, checking decorations, photographers, guests. Not the bride. Never Olivia. Everything about the evening felt polished for appearance rather than meaning. During the vows, I noticed two women seated behind me whispering softly. "That is the grandmother," one of them murmured. "The one who paid for all this." The other woman sighed quietly. "Poor thing." I looked down at my folded hands. The diamond wedding ring I still wore after 6 years of widowhood caught the candlelight for just a second. Arthur used to tell me that dignity mattered most when other people tried to take it from you. At the time, I thought he meant business, lawyers, competition. I did not realize he was trying to prepare me for family. When the ceremony ended, everyone rose applauding while Olivia and her new husband walked back down the aisle smiling beneath a shower of white rose petals. I stood with the others and clapped gently. Vanessa passed by me without making eye contact. But Daniel slowed for half a second beside my chair. Just long enough to whisper something under his breath without looking at me. "Please do not make tonight difficult." Then he kept walking. The reception began immediately after the ceremony, and within minutes the ballroom transformed into the kind of glittering celebration people spend years posting about online. The lights dimmed low while candles flickered across tables covered in white linen and gold trim. A jazz band played softly near the dance floor. Waiters carried plates of filet mignon and roasted vegetables through the crowd, while guests laughed loudly over expensive wine. Everything looked perfect from a distance. That was the strange thing about appearances. Sometimes they hid cruelty better than darkness ever could. I remained near the edge of the ballroom beside a towering arrangement of white orchids and eucalyptus branches, watching people drift from table to table in clusters of polished smiles and practiced conversations. Every now and then someone approached me with the same expression. Gratitude mixed with pity. "Beautiful wedding," they would say. "You must be so proud." I always nodded politely. "Olivia looks lovely," I answered each time. Because she did. She looked radiant spinning slowly across the dance floor during her first dance with Ethan while photographers circled them beneath floating lights. For a moment, I allowed myself to enjoy watching her happiness. Then I heard Vanessa laughing behind me near the champagne tower. "Honestly," she said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear, "if Helen did not have money sitting around from Arthur, none of this would exist." A few people chuckled awkwardly. Someone muttered, "That is a little harsh." Vanessa waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, she knows I am joking." I did not turn around immediately. I simply lifted my water glass and took a slow sip while staring at the dance floor. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. Daniel stood beside his wife holding a bourbon glass in one hand. He looked uncomfortable, tired, smaller somehow, but he still said nothing. That silence was becoming familiar. Vanessa continued speaking. "You should have seen the budget meetings," she laughed. "Every time we needed something, Daniel would say, 'Ask my mother.'" More laughter followed. Light, casual, careless. Then came the sentence that finally settled into my chest like a stone. I mean, eventually all that money was going to become ours anyway. Something inside me became very still after hearing that. Not shattered, not broken, just quiet. I thought about Arthur then. My husband had spent 43 years building Whitmore Financial with impossible discipline and exhausting patience. There were years he worked 14-hour days while I stayed home raising Daniel and helping with paperwork late at night after dinner dishes were done. We sacrificed vacations. We missed holidays. We lived carefully long before there was money. Arthur used to say wealth revealed character faster than poverty ever could. Back then, I thought he meant business partners, investors, competitors. I did not realize he was talking about family dinners and wedding receptions. A waiter approached carrying a tray of champagne glasses. I took one politely even though I had no intention of drinking it. Across the room, Olivia suddenly walked toward me, still glowing from the dance floor. "Grandma," she said warmly, hugging me carefully. "Are you okay?" Her voice softened when she noticed my expression. I touched her cheek gently. "You look beautiful tonight." "Thank you for everything," she whispered. Unlike the others, she said it quietly. Not like a performance. Not like a joke. Real gratitude. Before I could answer, Vanessa appeared beside her with perfect timing. "Olivia, sweetheart, the photographer needs you near the cake table." Then she looked at me and smiled brightly. "And Helen, do not disappear. We still need you for the family donor photo." Olivia frowned slightly. "The what?" Vanessa laughed as though everything in the world belonged to her. "Just a joke, honey." But I noticed something then. Olivia was no longer smiling. After the cake cutting, the ballroom grew louder. Wine glasses clinked together. Music drifted through the air while guests loosened ties and kicked off expensive shoes beneath the tables. The polished perfection of the evening had started to crack around the edges, and people were becoming more honest than they realized. I remained seated near the back corner beside the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Rain had begun falling softly against the glass, turning the city lights into blurry streaks of gold and white. I used to love nights like that when Arthur was alive. We would sit quietly together after charity events and laugh about how exhausting wealthy people could be. "Money makes some people graceful," he once told me, "and it turns others into performers." At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. Now I understood exactly what he meant. I watched Daniel across the room, standing with two business associates near the bar. His shoulders looked tense beneath his tuxedo jacket. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward Vanessa, almost as if he were waiting for her approval before speaking. That had not always been my son. Daniel used to be warm, gentle, thoughtful. After Arthur died 6 years earlier, something slowly changed inside him. At first it happened quietly. A canceled Sunday dinner here. A forgotten birthday call there. Then came the financial conversations disguised as emergencies. "Just temporary help, Mom. We are stretched thin right now." Olivia deserves stability. I believed every word because mothers are experts at confusing love with obligation. The first time Vanessa entered our family, she arrived carrying homemade lemon bars and a smile so sweet it almost felt rehearsed. She called me Mom within 2 weeks. She insisted on helping with dishes after dinner. She sent handwritten thank you notes after birthdays. Arthur did not trust her from the beginning. I remember the exact night he mentioned it. We were sitting on our back porch in Connecticut while late autumn leaves scraped softly across the deck. "Watch people carefully when money enters the room," he told me quietly. "Especially family." I accused him of being unfair, cynical, protective. Arthur only looked down into his coffee cup and changed the subject. 3 years later, Daniel asked for help with a down payment on a house larger than anything they actually needed. Vanessa cried at the closing dinner. "We could never have done this without you," she whispered while squeezing my hand across the restaurant table. 6 months later, they remodeled the kitchen and never invited me over once. The memories returned slowly now, one after another like puzzle pieces finally locking into place. The forgotten invitations, the expensive vacations, the sudden coldness whenever I questioned anything financial, the way Vanessa always became affectionate right before asking for something. I sat there staring at the rain while the truth settled heavily around me. I had not been loved. I had been managed. "Helen," a familiar voice said softly beside me. I looked up and nearly stopped breathing for a second. Martin Hale stood near the table holding a dark umbrella and wearing the same calm gray suit he had probably owned for 20 years. "Arthur's attorney. Arthur's closest friend." "I thought that was you," he said gently. May I sit down? I nodded. Slowly, Martin glanced once toward the crowded ballroom before lowering himself carefully into the chair beside mine. His expression remained polite, but his eyes looked troubled. Arthur would not have liked this evening, he said quietly. I looked down at my untouched champagne glass. Neither do I. Martin hesitated for a moment before reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he placed a sealed ivory envelope gently on the table between us. My name was written across the front in Arthur's handwriting. For several seconds, I could not move. The noise of the ballroom faded into something distant and hollow while I stared at the envelope resting beneath the chandelier light. Arthur's handwriting had always been neat and deliberate, every letter shaped with careful precision. Seeing it again after 6 years felt like hearing his voice through a locked door. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Martin folded his hands quietly in front of him. He did not rush me. He had known Arthur long enough to understand silence. Around us, guests continued laughing near the dance floor, while waiters carried slices of wedding cake from table to table. Somewhere across the ballroom, Vanessa's sharp laugh cut through the music for a brief moment before disappearing again beneath the crowd. I finally reached for the envelope with trembling fingers. The paper felt thick and expensive, the kind Arthur always insisted on using for important documents. On the back flap was a single sentence written in blue ink. For Helen. Open only when you finally see them clearly. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I looked at Martin. You knew about this? He nodded once. Arthur gave it to me 3 months before he passed away. A cold feeling settled quietly into my stomach. Why would he think I would need this? Martin exhaled slowly and glanced toward Daniel across the ballroom. Because your husband noticed things you chose not to see. I lowered my eyes. Deep down, I already knew that was true. Arthur had always been observant in ways that made people uncomfortable. He noticed hesitation in conversations, greed hidden beneath politeness, tiny changes in tone, the kind of details most people ignored until it was too late. I slipped my finger carefully beneath the envelope flap and unfolded the letter inside. The paper crackled softly in my hands. Helen, if you are reading this, then I was right about something I prayed I would be wrong about. First, I need you to understand this clearly. None of what they are doing is your fault. Loving your family generously is not weakness. But there are people in this world who mistake kindness for permission. I paused, blinking slowly while the ballroom lights blurred for a second. Arthur's voice felt alive inside every sentence. Calm, measured, direct. If Daniel allows anyone to humiliate you for money, status, or convenience, then he is not behaving like the son we raised. And if his wife encourages it, Martin has instructions regarding the family trust that he will explain when the time comes. Do not argue with them. Do not beg for respect. Simply pay attention. People eventually reveal themselves when they believe your love guarantees your silence. My hands tightened around the letter. Across the ballroom, Vanessa stood near the head table taking photographs with several guests while Daniel remained beside her, smiling mechanically for the camera. Neither of them looked in my direction. Arthur's final paragraph was shorter than the others. You spent your life protecting this family, Helen. Now protect yourself. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. For a moment, neither Martin nor I spoke. The jazz band had started another slow song, while rain continued sliding down the windows overlooking the city. Finally, Martin reached into his briefcase and placed a thin black folder gently beside my champagne glass. Arthur amended the Whitmore family trust before he died. He said quietly, there is a clause regarding financial abuse, public humiliation, and intentional exploitation involving family beneficiaries. I looked at him slowly. What does that mean? Martin's expression remained calm, but his eyes hardened slightly. It means Daniel and Vanessa may have spent the last 6 years assuming they were inheriting a fortune that no longer belongs to them. Martin closed the black folder quietly and slid it back toward himself before anyone nearby could notice the documents inside. The ballroom lights reflected softly across the polished table, while music drifted through the air like nothing in the world had changed. But everything had changed. I just had not decided what to do with the truth yet. You do not need to make any decisions tonight, Martin said gently. Arthur only wanted you to understand that you have options. I nodded slowly without answering. Across the room, Vanessa climbed onto the small stage beside the dance floor holding a champagne glass and tapping lightly against it with a silver spoon. The room gradually quieted as guests turned toward her smiling expectantly. Speech, someone called out happily. Vanessa laughed and adjusted the microphone. I promise to keep this short, she said brightly. Although after the amount of money spent tonight, maybe I should make it worth the investment. Scattered laughter moved across the ballroom. My stomach tightened slightly. Vanessa smiled wider as she looked around the room. First, thank you all for being here to celebrate Olivia and Ethan tonight. More applause followed. And of course, she continued dramatically, a very special thank you to Helen Whitmore. Several heads turned toward me immediately. I remained seated beside the window with my hands folded calmly in my lap. Vanessa lifted her glass higher. None of this would exist without her generosity. Her tone sounded sweet enough on the surface, but underneath it rested something sharp and humiliating that everyone could feel. Honestly, she laughed lightly. Every family should have someone willing to fund the dream. A few guests chuckled politely. Others looked uncomfortable. Daniel stood beside the stage, staring down into his bourbon glass, without speaking. Again, always silence. Vanessa continued smiling into the microphone. So tonight, let us raise a glass to Helen, the woman who proved you really can take it with you. More awkward laughter followed, thinner this time. I noticed Olivia standing near the sweetheart table, slowly lowering her champagne flute. Her expression had changed. Completely. Embarrassment. Confusion. Hurt. Ethan leaned toward her, whispering something quietly, while she continued staring at her mother. Vanessa either did not notice or did not care. I looked down briefly at Arthur's envelope resting inside my purse beside the old laminated name tag. Then I lifted my own water glass calmly and stood from my chair. The room became strangely quiet as people watched me. Vanessa smiled confidently, clearly expecting gratitude or some harmless joke to smooth everything over. Instead, I simply raised my glass slightly toward her. To family, I said softly. My voice carried farther through the ballroom than I expected. May we always recognize the difference between generosity and entitlement. The silence afterward felt immediate and heavy. Vanessa's smile flickered for half a second. Daniel finally looked directly at me for the first time all evening. And across the table beside me, Martin Hale lowered his eyes slowly into his drink like a man who already knew exactly how this story would end. The music resumed a few seconds later, but something inside the ballroom had shifted. Conversations sounded quieter now, more careful. People smiled, but the warmth no longer felt natural. Vanessa stepped down from the stage, still holding her champagne glass, though the confidence in her expression had dimmed slightly. She avoided looking directly at me as she moved through the crowd, greeting guests with practiced elegance. Daniel, however, looked unsettled. He loosened his bow tie near the bar and drank the rest of his bourbon too quickly. I sat back down slowly beside the window while rain continued tracing silver lines against the glass. Martin leaned toward me slightly. You handled that well, he said quietly. Arthur would have approved. I stared at the dance floor where Olivia and Ethan were speaking softly together near the cake table. I am tired, Martin, I admitted. Not angry, just tired. He nodded gently. That usually comes first. For the next hour, I simply watched. Sometimes clarity arrives loudly. Other times it arrives in tiny moments people never think anyone notices. Vanessa laughing too hard when guests complimented. The floral arrangements I had paid for. Daniel promising a business associate they would soon be purchasing property in Aspen. The casual confidence with which they discussed a future built entirely on money they assumed already belonged to them. Neither of them asked whether I was cold sitting near the window. Neither asked whether I had eaten dinner. Neither noticed I had stopped smiling completely. Around 10:30, guests began moving toward the outdoor terrace overlooking the city skyline for photographs and cocktails. Olivia approached my table quietly, smoothing the front of her satin gown nervously. Grandma, she said softly, can we talk for a minute? I looked up at her gentle face and saw genuine concern there. Not obligation. Not performance. Real concern. Of course, sweetheart. She sat beside me carefully. I did not know about the name tag, she whispered immediately. And I did not know Mom said those things during her speech. Her eyes looked glossy beneath the ballroom lights. I am so sorry. I reached over and squeezed her hand lightly. This is your wedding night, Olivia. That does not make it okay. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. For a moment, she looked very young again, like the little girl who used to crawl into my lap after nightmares. I smiled faintly. You are the only person here who thought to ask if I was hurting. Tears filled her eyes instantly. Before I could say anything else, Vanessa appeared across the ballroom, calling Olivia's name sharply toward the photographer. Olivia looked back at her mother, then at me again. There was hesitation in her face now. Awareness. The beginning of understanding. Go enjoy your evening, I told her softly. Nothing needs to happen tonight. She hugged me carefully before walking away toward the terrace. I watched her disappear into the crowd beside her mother, and suddenly I understood something Arthur had known long before I did. Protecting your peace sometimes means disappointing the people who only valued your silence. By 11:30, the reception had begun thinning out. Older guests gathered their coats while younger relatives drifted toward the terrace bar. Overlooking the rain-soaked skyline, the ballroom no longer looked magical under the dimmed lights. Flowers drooped slightly in their crystal vases. Half-empty champagne glasses cluttered the tables. Laughter sounded tired now. Forced. I remained seated near the window long after most people had moved outside. Martin had already left quietly after pressing my hand once before disappearing into the elevator lobby. Call me tomorrow, he said softly. Do not wait too long. I watched the elevator doors close behind him and felt strangely calm, almost peaceful. Across the ballroom, Daniel finally approached me alone. His face looked pale beneath the soft gold lighting, and the confidence he wore earlier in the evening had completely disappeared. Mom, he said carefully as he pulled out the chair across from me. Can we talk? I folded my napkin neatly beside my untouched dessert plate. We are talking. He glanced briefly toward the terrace, where Vanessa stood laughing with several guests beneath outdoor heaters. Even from across the room, she looked perfectly composed. Vanessa did not mean anything by those jokes tonight, he said quietly. Things just got stressful with the wedding planning. I studied my son's face for several seconds. There were lines around his eyes now that I had never noticed before. Tension, exhaustion, avoidance. Do you know what hurt the most tonight? I asked softly. He rubbed his forehead. Mom, please. It was not the name tag. He looked up slowly. It was watching you pretend not to see it. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. Silence stretched between us while distant music drifted in from the terrace speakers outside. Finally, he sighed heavily. You always make everything emotional. I stared at him in disbelief, though my expression barely changed. There it was. The sentence people use when accountability becomes inconvenient. Interesting, I said quietly. Your father used to say something similar about people who mistake guilt for discomfort. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. What is that supposed to mean? Before I could answer, Vanessa walked briskly across the ballroom toward us in silver heels, her smile already strained. There you are, she said sharply to Daniel before turning toward me with fake brightness. Helen, we are organizing family brunch tomorrow morning before everyone flies home. We were thinking maybe you could host it at your lake house since everyone loves the property so much. I looked at her calmly. The lake house. Another assumption. Another expense volunteered on my behalf without even asking. Vanessa continued speaking before I answered. And Daniel mentioned you were still planning to help with Olivia and Ethan's condo down payment next month. Daniel avoided looking at me completely now. I felt something settle firmly into place inside my chest. Not anger. Decision. Quiet and final. I picked up my purse slowly from beside the chair and stood. No, I said softly. Vanessa blinked. No. No brunch at the lake house. I adjusted my jacket carefully. And no condo down payment. The confusion on Vanessa's face appeared almost childlike for a moment. Helen, I think there is some misunderstanding here. No, I repeated gently. For the first time tonight, there really is not. The ballroom fell completely silent after I said it. Not dramatic silence. Not the kind from movies where music stops and people gasp. This silence was smaller than that. Sharper. The kind that settles quietly between people when they suddenly realize the rules have changed. Vanessa stared at me as though she genuinely could not understand what she had just heard. Helen, she said slowly, forcing a nervous laugh. You are upset. We can talk about this tomorrow. No, I answered calmly. Tomorrow I will be meeting with Martin Hale. Daniel finally looked at me directly. Why? His voice carried something unfamiliar now. Concern. Real concern. I held his gaze steadily. Because your father prepared for this long before I did. Neither of them spoke. Across the ballroom, guests continued pretending not to watch us while very obviously listening. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. I do not understand why you are acting like this over a few harmless jokes. I almost smiled then. Not from amusement. From clarity. People reveal themselves in moments they consider harmless. I said softly. That is why those moments matter. Daniel stood abruptly from his chair. Mom, enough. The frustration in his voice echoed slightly through the nearly empty ballroom. You are embarrassing us. I looked at my son for a long moment. Somewhere deep inside me, I realized I had spent years fearing this exact feeling. The fear of disappointing him. The fear of creating conflict. The fear of no longer being needed. And suddenly, standing there beneath fading wedding lights while rain tapped softly against the windows, that fear disappeared completely. No, Daniel, I said quietly. Tonight, I finally stopped embarrassing myself. His expression changed instantly. Hurt, shock, maybe even shame. Vanessa opened her mouth again, but Olivia appeared beside us before she could speak. Her mascara had smudged slightly beneath tired eyes. Grandma, she whispered, please do not leave like this. I touched her cheek gently. Sweetheart, this has nothing to do with you. Olivia looked between her parents and me with visible confusion settling across her face piece by piece. For the first time, she was seeing them clearly. The same way I finally had. I reached into my purse and removed the laminated name tag carefully before placing it on the empty dessert plate beside my champagne glass. The cheap plastic looked strange, sitting among crystal and silverware. Small, ugly, honest. Vanessa's eyes locked onto it immediately. It was only a joke, she muttered weakly. I nodded once. Yes, I said softly. That is what cruel people usually call it afterward. No one answered me after that. I slipped Arthur's letter back into my purse, gathered my coat from the chair, and walked slowly toward the ballroom exit alone. My heels moved quietly across the marble floor, while conversations behind me remained frozen in uneasy silence. Just before reaching the elevator lobby, I turned once more toward the glowing reception hall filled with flowers I had paid for, music I had paid for, and people who had mistaken generosity for permission. Then I looked at Daniel one final time. Your father was right, I said calmly. Respect matters more than inheritance. The elevator doors opened softly behind me, and for the first time in years, I walked away from my family without feeling guilty at all.